Rebecca, by Daphne du Maurier. Last night, I dreamt I went to Mandalay again. I came upon it suddenly, the approach masked by the unnatural growth of a vast shrub that spread in all directions, and I stood, my heart thumping in my breast, the strange prick of tears behind my eyes. There was Mandalay, our Mandalay, secretive and silent as it had always been. The grey stone shining in the moonlight of my dream, the mullioned windows reflecting the green lawns and the terrace. The terrace sloped to the lawns, and the lawns stretched to the sea, placid under the moon, like a lake undisturbed by wind or storm. I turned again to the house. It stood inviolate, untouched, as though we ourselves had left but yesterday. Moonlight can play odd tricks upon the fancy, even upon a dreamer's fancy, and I stood there, hushed and still. I could swear that the house was not an empty shell, but lived and breathed as it had lived before. Like most sleepers, I knew that I dreamed. In reality, I lay many hundred miles away in an alien land and would wake, before many seconds had passed, in the bare little hotel bedroom, comforting in its very lack of atmosphere. I would sigh a moment, stretch myself and turn, and opening my eyes, be bewildered at that glittering sun, that hard, clean sky so different from the soft moonlight of my dream. The day would lie before us both, long, no doubt, and uneventful, but fraught with a certain stillness, a dear tranquillity we had not known before. We would not talk of Mandalay. I would not tell my dream. For Mandalay was ours no longer. Mandalay was no more. We can never go back again. That much is certain. The past is still too close to us. The things we have tried to forget and put behind us would stir again. We have both known fear and loneliness and very great distress. We have come through our crisis, not unscathed, of course. His premonition of disaster was correct from the beginning. We have no secrets now from one another. All things are shared. Granted that our little hotel is dull, and the food indifferent, and that day after day dawns very much the same, yet we would not have it otherwise. I suppose his dependence upon me has made me bold at last. At any rate, I have lost my diffidence, my timidity, my shyness with strangers. I am very different from that self who drove to Mandalay for the first time, hopeful and eager, handicapped by a rather desperate gaucherie and filled with an intense desire to please. It was my lack of poise, of course, that made such a bad impression on people like Mrs. Danvers. What must I have seemed like after Rebecca? I can see myself now, memory spanning the years like a bridge, with straight, bobbed hair and youthful, unpowdered face, dressed in an ill-fitting coat and skirt and jumper of my own creation, trailing in the wake of Mrs. Van Hopper, like a shy, uneasy colt. She would precede me into lunch, her short body ill-balanced upon tottering high heels. She would make for her usual table in the corner of the restaurant, close to the window, and lifting her lorgnette to her small pig's eyes, survey the scene to right and left of her, then utter a little exclamation of disgust. Not a single well-known personality. I shall tell the management they must make a reduction on my bill. What do they think I come here for? To look at the page boys? I remember we ate in silence, for Mrs. Van Hopper liked to concentrate on food. It was not a sight that engendered into me great appetite, and looking away from her, I saw that the table next to ours, left vacant for 3 days, was to be occupied once more. The maitre d'hotel, with the particular bow reserved for his more special patrons, was ushering the new arrival to his place. Mrs. Van Hopper put down her fork and reached for her lorgnette. Then she leant across the table to me, her small eyes bright with excitement, her voice a shade too loud. "It's Max de Winter," she said. "The man who owns Mandalay. You've heard of it, of course. He looks ill, doesn't he? They say he can't get over his wife's death. I wonder what my life would be today if Mrs. Van Hopper had not been a snob. For many years now she had come to the Hotel Côte d'Azur, and apart from bridge, her one pastime, which was notorious by now in Monte Carlo, was to claim visitors of distinction as her friends, had she but seen them once at the other end of the post office. I can see her as though it were but yesterday, on that unforgettable afternoon. Never mind how many years ago, when she sat at her favourite sofa in the lounge, debating her method of attack. Suddenly she turned to me, her small eyes alight. "Go upstairs quickly and find that letter from my nephew. You remember, the one written on his honeymoon with the snapshot?" I saw then that her plans were formed, and the nephew was to be the means of introduction. This newcomer would not welcome intrusion, I felt certain of that. When I returned, I saw he had already left the dining room, and she, fearful of losing him, had not waited for the letter, but had risked a barefaced introduction of her own. He was even now sitting beside her on the sofa. I walked across to them, and gave her the letter without a word. He rose to his feet at once, while Mrs. Van Hopper, flushed with her success, waved a vague hand in my direction and mumbled my name. "Mr. de Winter is having coffee with us. Go and ask the waiter for another cup," she said, her tone just casual enough to warn him of my footing. It was a surprise, therefore, to find that this newcomer remained standing on his feet, and it was he who made a signal to the waiter.
"I'm afraid I must contradict you,"
he said to her.
"You're both having coffee with me."
"You know, I recognized you just as soon as you walked into the restaurant," she said. "And I thought, why, there's Mr. de Winter, Billy's friend. He gave that party at Claridge's where I saw you first. But I dare say you don't remember an old woman like me." This, with a provocative glance and a gleam of teeth.
"On the contrary, I remember you very well,"
he said. And before she could trap him into a resurrection of their first meeting, he had handed her his cigarette case, and the business of lighting up stalled her for the moment. I was too young, that was the trouble. Had I been older, I would have caught his eye and smiled, her unbelievable behaviour making a bond between us. But as it was, I was stricken into shame, and endured one of the frequent agonies of youth. I think he realised my distress, for he leant forward in his chair and spoke to me, his voice gentle, asking if I would have more coffee, and when I refused and shook my head, I felt his eyes were still on me, puzzled, reflective. He was pondering my exact relationship to her, and wondering whether he must bracket us together in futility.
"What do you think of Monte Carlo? Or don't you think of it at all?"
I said something obvious and idiotic about the place being artificial. But before I could finish my halting sentence, Mrs. Van Hopper interrupted. "She's spoilt, Mr. de Winter. That's her trouble. Most girls would give their eyes for the chance of seeing Monty."
"Wouldn't that rather defeat the purpose?"
he said, smiling. She shrugged her shoulders, blowing a great cloud of cigarette smoke into the air. I don't think she understood him for a moment. She ran on, through a tangled fringe of gossip, never seeing that the names were alien to him. They meant nothing, and that, as she prattled unaware, he grew colder and more silent. It was the page boy in the end who released him, with news that a dressmaker awaited Mrs. Van Hopper in the suite. He got up at once, pushing back his chair.
"Don't let me keep you. Fashions change so quickly nowadays, they may even have altered by the time you get upstairs."
The sting did not touch her. She accepted it as a pleasantry, and we went towards the lift. The next morning, Mrs. Van Hopper woke with a sore throat and a temperature of 102. I rang up her doctor, who came round at once and diagnosed the usual influenza. I left her quite happy after the arrival of a nurse, propped up on pillows with a falling temperature, and went down to the restaurant for lunch, a good half hour before our usual time. I expected the room to be empty. It was, except for the table next to ours. No doubt he was lunching early because he hoped to avoid us at 1 o'clock. It was a situation for which I was ill-trained. I went to our table, looking straight ahead of me, and immediately paid the penalty of gaucherie by knocking over the vase of stiff anemones as I unfolded my napkin. The water soaked the cloth and ran down onto my lap. In a second, though, my neighbour was by my side, a dry napkin in hand.
"You can't sit at a wet tablecloth, it'll put you off your food,"
he said brusquely. The waiter, seeing the disturbance, came swiftly to the rescue.
"Leave that. Lay another place at my table. Mademoiselle will have luncheon with me."
"Please," I begged, Don't be polite. It's very kind of you, but I should be quite all right if the waiter just wipes the cloth.
But I'm not being polite. I'd like you to have luncheon with me. Even if you'd not knocked over the vase so clumsily, I should have asked you.
I suppose my face told him of my doubt, for he smiled.
You don't believe me? Never mind. We needn't talk to each other unless we feel like it.
We ate for a while without talking. Then he said,
Your friend, she's very much older than you. Have you known her long?
She's not really a friend, I told him. She's an employer. She's training me to be a thing called a companion, and she pays me £90 a year. He laughed, looking quite different, younger somehow, and less detached.
What do you do it for?
£90 is a lot of money to me.
Haven't you any family?
No, they're dead. He asked me about my family, and my shyness fell away from me, loosening as it did so my reluctant tongue. I remember pausing, a little breathless, a little dazed. We had been sitting there for an hour and a half, and the conversation had been mine alone. I tumbled down into reality, hot-handed and self-conscious, with my face aflame, and began to stammer my apologies. He would not listen to me.
I've enjoyed this time with you more than I've enjoyed anything for a very long time. You've taken me out of myself, out of despondency and introspection, both of which have been my devils for a year.
I looked at him and believed he spoke the truth.
You know, we've got a bond in common, you and I. We're both alone in the world. Oh, I've got a sister and an ancient grandmother whom I pay duty visits to 3 times a year, but neither of them make for companionship.
You forget, I said. You have a home, and I have none. The moment I spoke, I regretted my words, for the secret, inscrutable look came back into his eyes again.
An empty house can be as lonely as a full hotel.
I thought he was going to talk of Mandalay at last, but something held him back. At length he said, on a level plane again,
So, the friend of the bosom has a holiday. What does she propose to do with it?
I thought of a cobbled square I'd seen and wanted to draw. I could be off there by 3 o'clock with my sketchbook and pencil, and I told him as much, a little shyly perhaps. Like all untalented persons with a pet hobby.
I'll drive you there in the car,
he said, and would not listen to protests. Mine was a happy mood that afternoon, and I remember it well. It was not the Monte Carlo I had known. There was a glamour about it that had not been before. I must have looked upon it before with dull eyes. The wind was too high for sketching, so we drove I know not where. The long road climbed the hills, and the car climbed with it. Suddenly, he began to talk about Mandalay. He said nothing of his life there, no word about himself, but he told me how the sun set there, how the garden bloomed, and how from the terrace you could hear the ripple of the coming tide washing in the little bay. Too soon we came back to the hotel, and I felt for my gloves in the pocket of the car. I found them, and my fingers closed upon a book as well, whose slim covers told of poetry. I peered to read the title.
You can take it and read it if you like,
he said, his voice casual and indifferent now that the drive was over. I was glad and held it tightly with my gloves. I felt I wanted some possession of his, now that the day was finished.
Hop out. I shan't see you in the restaurant this evening, but thank you for today.
I went up the hotel steps alone, with all the despondency of a child whose treat is over. I could not face the possibilities of Mrs. Van Hopper's husky interrogation, so I sat down in the corner of the lounge behind a pillar and ordered tea. I took up the book of poems, and it opened at the title page, and I read the dedication. Max, from Rebecca. The name Rebecca stood out black and strong, the tall and sloping R dwarfing the other letters. I shut the book with a snap, and saw in my mind the face of Mrs. Van Hopper in the restaurant the day before. An appalling tragedy, she was saying. The papers were full of it, of course. They say he never talks about it, never mentions her name. She was drowned, you know, in the bay near Mandalay. Mrs. Van Hopper continued to play the invalid, and I did not tell her that every morning I drove with Mr. de Winter in his car, and lunched with him too at his table in the restaurant. He would be there every morning in the driver's seat, reading a paper while he waited for me. And when he saw me, he would smile, saying,
Well, how's the friend of the bosom this morning, and where does she want to go?
If he had driven me round in circles, it would not have mattered to me. I would sit with his map upon my lap, the wind blowing my dull, lanky hair, happy in his silence, yet eager for his words. My only enemy was the clock on the dashboard, whose hands would move relentlessly to 1 o'clock. "I wish I was a woman of about 36, dressed in black satin with a string of pearls," I said once.
"Well, you wouldn't be sitting in this car with me if you were,"
he said. "You'll think me impertinent and rude, I dare say," I went on, "but I would like to know why you asked me to come out in the car day after day. You are being kind, that's obvious, but why do you choose me for your charity?" I sat up stiff and straight in my seat with all the poor pomposity of youth.
"I ask you,"
he said gravely,
"because you're not dressed in black satin with a string of pearls, nor are you 36.
It's all very well. You know everything there is to know about me. There's not much, I admit. I know nothing more about you than I did the first day we met."
"And what did you know then?"
"Why, that you lived at Mandalay and that you had lost your wife." There I had said it at last, the word that hovered on my tongue for days. Your wife. I remember staring straight in front of me at the windscreen, seeing nothing of the flying road, my ears still tingling with that spoken word. The silence became minutes, and the minutes became miles, and everything is over now, I thought. I shall never drive with him again. Then we stopped, drawing up by the side of the road. He turned to me and spoke.
"Something happened a year ago that altered my whole life, and I want to forget every phase in my existence up to that time. You have blotted out the past for me, you know, far more effectively than all the bright lights of Monte Carlo. But for you I should have left long ago. Damn your idea of my kindness and my charity. I ask you to come with me because I want you and your company."
Without a word he started up the engine and turned the car round the way we had come. The tears welled into my eyes and strayed upon my cheeks. Suddenly he put out his hand and took hold of mine and kissed it, still saying nothing, and then he threw his handkerchief on my lap. I blew my nose, throwing my drab appearance to the winds. It could never matter.
"To hell with this,"
he said suddenly, and pulled me beside him, and put his arm around my shoulder, still looking straight ahead of him, his right hand on the wheel. He drove, I remember, even faster than before.
"I suppose you're young enough to be my daughter, and I don't know how to deal with you. My family always called me Maxim. I'd like you to do the same. You've been formal with me long enough."
He felt for the brim of my hat and took hold of it, throwing it over his shoulder to the back seat, and then bent down and kissed the top of my head.
"Promise me you'll never wear black satin."
I smiled then, and he laughed back at me, and the morning was a shining thing. It had happened at last, the business of going away. It was all over. I should say goodbye to him in the lounge, perhaps before we left. A furtive, scrambled farewell, because of her. And there would be a pause and a smile, and words like,
"Yes, of course, do write,"
while my mind clamoured painfully, crying, "I love you so much. I'm terribly unhappy. This has never come to me before and never will again." "I hate hanging about once everything is packed," Mrs. Van Hopper grumbled on the morning of our departure. "We ought to have decided on the earlier train." She glanced at her watch. "I suppose they could change the reservations. Go down to the office and see." This was the end, then. Even my morning must be taken from me because she was bored. Well, then, I would fling away restraint and modesty. I would not be proud any more. I knew the number of his room, and I hammered at the door, very flushed in the face and breathless.
"Come in."
I opened the door, repenting already, my nerve failing me. He was shaving by the open window, a camel-hair jacket over his pyjamas. I was merely foolish when I felt myself dramatic.
"What do you want? Is something the matter?"
"I've come to say goodbye. We're going this morning." He stared at me, then put his razor down on the washstand.
"Shut the door."
I closed it behind me and stood there, my hands hanging by my side. He asked,
"What on earth are you talking about?"
"It's true. We're leaving today, and I was afraid I shouldn't see you again. I felt I must see you before I left, to thank you." They tumbled out, the idiotic words, and I was stiff and awkward.
"Why didn't you tell me about this before?"
"She only decided yesterday. We're sailing for New York." He picked up his razor again and took the soap off his face.
"Sit down. I'll dress in the bathroom and be ready in 5 minutes."
When he returned, he said,
"So, Mrs. Van Hopper has had enough of Monte Carlo and she wants to go home." So do I. She to New York, and I to Mandalay. Which do you prefer? You can take your choice. Either you go to America with Mrs. Van Hopper, or you come home to Mandalay with me.
Do you mean you want a secretary or something?
No, I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool.
I don't believe, even in my fiercest moments, I'd considered this possibility.
My suggestion doesn't seem to have gone too well. I'm sorry. I rather thought you loved me. A fine blow to my conceit.
I do love you. I love you dreadfully. I've been crying all night because I thought I should never see you again. When I said this, I remember he laughed.
Bless you for that. One day, when you reach that exalted age of 36, which you told me was your ambition, I'll remind you of this moment, and you won't believe me. It's a pity you have to grow up.
I was ashamed already, and angry with him for laughing. So women did not make those confessions to men. I had a lot to learn.
So, that's settled, isn't it?
He looked at me and saw the anxiety on my face.
I'm being rather a brute to you, aren't I? This isn't your idea of a proposal. We ought to be in a conservatory. You in a white frock with a rose in your hand and a violin playing a waltz in the distance. Poor darling, what a shame. Never mind. I'll take you to Venice for our honeymoon, and we'll hold hands in the gondola. But we won't stay for too long, because I want to show you Mandalay.
He wanted to show me Mandalay. And suddenly I realised that it would all happen. I would be his wife. I would be Mrs. de Winter.
Am I going to break the news to Mrs. Van Hopper, or are you?
You tell her. She'll be so angry. When we entered the suite, Mrs. Van Hopper called from the sitting room. What in the name of Mike have you been doing?
I'm afraid it's all my fault,
he said, going into the sitting room, shutting the door behind him, and I heard her exclamation of surprise. After a while, the door opened again, and he came into the room.
All's well. Shock made her speechless at first, but she's beginning to recover, so I'm going downstairs to the office to make certain she'll catch the first train. Go and talk to her.
He smiled and waved his hand and went off down the corridor alone. I went to Mrs. Van Hopper, uncertain, rather self-conscious. Well, she said, her voice dry and hard, not the voice she would have used to him. It was a lucky thing for you that I had the influenza. She looked at me curiously and ran her eyes over my figure, like a judge at a cattle show. There was something inquisitive about her eyes, something unpleasant. Of course, you know why he's marrying you, don't you? You haven't flattered yourself he's in love with you. The fact is, that empty house got in his nerves to such an extent he nearly went off his head. He admitted as much before you came into the room. You just can't go on living there alone. We came to Mandalay in early May, arriving, so Maxim said, with the first swallows and the bluebells. Now the moment was upon me, and I wished it delayed. I wanted to be a traveller on the road, a bride in love with her husband, not myself coming to Mandalay for the first time, the wife of Maxim de Winter. Any measure of self-possession I had gained hitherto during the brief 7 weeks of marriage was like a rag now, fluttering before the wind.
Here we are,
he said, a new note of excitement in his voice, and I gripped the leather seat of the car with my 2 hands. The road curved, and before us on the left were 2 high iron gates beside a lodge, open wide to the long drive beyond. Perhaps he guessed something of my shyness at last, for he took my hand and kissed it and laughed a little, even as he spoke.
Well, you mustn't mind if there's a certain amount of curiosity. Everyone will want to know what you're like. You've only got to be yourself and they'll adore you. And you don't have to worry about the house. Mrs. Danvers does everything. Just leave it all to her. She'll be stiff with you at first, I dare say, but you mustn't let it worry you. It's just her manner.
The drive twisted and turned as a serpent, scarce wider in places than a path, and above our heads was a great colonnade of trees. Suddenly I saw a clearing in the dark drive ahead, and a patch of sky, and in a moment the dark trees had thinned, and we turned the last corner, and so came to Mandalay. As we drove up to the wide stone steps and stopped before the open door, I saw through one of the mullioned windows that the hall was full of people, and I heard Maxim swear under his breath.
Damn that woman, she knows perfectly well I didn't want this sort of thing.
What's the matter? I said. Who are all those people?
I'm afraid you'll have to face it now,
he said, in irritation.
Mrs. Danvers has collected the whole damn staff in the house and on the estate to welcome us. It's all right. You won't have to say anything. I'll do it all.
I fumbled for the handle of the door, feeling slightly sick. The butler came down the steps, followed by a footman, and he opened the door for me.
Well, here we are, Frith. Everyone well?
The butler replied.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Glad to see you home and hope you've been keeping well. And madam, too? Yes, we're both well, thank you, Frith. Rather tired from the drive and wanting our tea. I didn't expect this business. Mrs. Danvers' orders, sir.
Maxim and I went up the steps, and there, ranged one behind the other in the hall, a sea of faces, open-mouthed and curious. Someone advanced from the sea of faces, someone tall and gaunt, dressed in deep black, whose prominent cheekbones and great hollow eyes gave her a skull's face, parchment white, set on a skeleton's frame.
This is Mrs. Danvers,
said Maxim, and she began to speak. I cannot remember her words now, but I know that she bade me welcome to Mandalay. I saw a little smile of scorn upon her lips, and I guessed at once she considered me ill-bred. Maxim took my arm and bore me off to the library to tea, closing the doors behind us, and we were alone again. 2 cocker spaniels came from the far side to greet us. They pawed at Maxim, then came to me, sniffing at my heels, rather uncertain, rather suspicious. One was the mother, blind in one eye, and soon she had enough of me. But Jasper, the younger, put his nose into my hand and laid a chin upon my knee. It was a deep, comfortable room with books lining the walls to the ceiling. The long windows looked out upon the lawns, and beyond the lawns to the distant shimmer of the sea. A room for peace, a room for meditation. Frith came in.
Mrs. Danvers wondered, madam, whether you would like to see your room.
Maxim glanced up from his letters.
What sort of job have they made of the East Wing? Very nice indeed, sir, it seems to me. I should imagine you'll be very comfortable there, sir. It's a lot lighter, of course, on that side of the house.
Have you been making alterations? I asked.
Oh, nothing much. Run along and make friends with Mrs. Danvers. It's a good opportunity.
I got up slowly, my old nervousness returning, and went out into the hall. A black figure stood waiting for me at the head of the stairs, the hollow eyes watching me intently from the white skull's face. I went up the great stairs towards her, and she waited motionless, her hands folded before her, her eyes never leaving my face. I hope I haven't kept you waiting, I said. It's for you to make your own time, madam, she answered. We went along a broad, carpeted passage, and we came to a little anteroom, or boudoir, furnished with a sofa, chairs, and a writing desk, which opened out to a large double bedroom with wide windows and a bathroom beyond. It's a very charming room, I said, and I'm sure I shall be comfortable. I understand that it's been done up for our return. Yes, she said. It was never used much, except for occasional visitors, but Mr. de Winter gave special orders in his letter that you would have this room. Then this was not his bedroom originally, I said. No, madam. He's never used the room in this wing before. Oh, I said. He didn't tell me that. Alice has unpacked for you and will look after you until your maid arrives, said Mrs. Danvers. I don't have a maid, I said awkwardly. She wore the same expression that she had done on our first meeting. If you think it necessary, perhaps you would see about it for me, I said, avoiding her eyes. Some young girl, perhaps, wanting to train. If you wish, she said. It's for you to say. There was silence between us. I wished she would go away. I suppose you've been at Mandalay for many years, I said, making a fresh effort. I came here when the first Mrs. de Winter was a bride, she said, and her voice was harsh now with unexpected animation, with life and meaning, and there was a spot of colour on the gaunt cheekbones. The change was so sudden that I was shocked and a little scared. I did not know what to do or what to say. She hesitated by the doorway, her hand on the handle of the open door. It was as though she still had something to say to me and could not decide upon the words. Mr. de Winter said you would prefer to be on this side, she said. The bedroom in the big suite in the West Wing was Mrs. de Winter's room. Then I saw a shadow flit across her face, and she drew back against the wall, effacing herself, as a step sounded outside and Maxim came into the room.
How is it, all right? Do you think you'll like it?
He looked around with enthusiasm, pleased as a schoolboy.
I always thought this was a most attractive room. You've made a great success of it, Mrs. Danvers. I give you full marks.
Thank you, sir, she said, her face expressionless. And then she turned and went out of the room, closing the door softly behind her.
How did you get on with old Danvers?
She seems just a little bit stiff, I said, after a moment or two. After all, it's natural enough that she would resent me a bit at first.
Resent you? Why resent you? What the devil do you mean?
He turned from the window, frowning, an odd, half-angry expression on his face. I wondered why he should mind, and I wished I had said something else. I mean, it must be much easier for a housekeeper to look after a man alone. Perhaps she was afraid I should be very overbearing.
Overbearing? My God, if you think...
And then he stopped and came across to me and kissed me on the top of my head.
Let's forget about Mrs. Danvers. Come along and let me show you something of Mandalay.
I remember that first morning Maxim was up and dressed and writing letters even before breakfast.
By the way, my sister Beatrice has asked herself over to lunch. I suppose she wants to have a look at you.
Today, I said, my spirits sinking to zero.
Yes. You'll like her, I think. She's very direct, believes in speaking her mind.
I found this hardly comforting. Maxim got up from his chair.
I've got a mass of things to see to this morning. Do you think you could amuse yourself? I'd like to have taken you round the garden, but I must see Crawley, my agent.
Of course, I said. I should be quite happy. Then he picked up his letters and went out of the room, and I remember thinking this was not how I imagined my first morning. I lingered long over my first breakfast, spinning out the time, and it was not until I saw Frith come in and look at me from behind the service screen that I realised it was after 10 o'clock.
There's a good fire in the morning room, madam. Mrs. de Winter always did all her correspondence and telephoning there after breakfast. The house telephone is also there, should you wish to speak to Mrs. Danvers.
Thank you, Frith. I turned away into the hall again, humming a little tune to give me an air of confidence. I could not tell him that I had never seen the morning room, that Maxim had not shown it to me. I had not deceived him, though, not for a moment.
You go through the drawing-room to the morning room, madam. Through the door there, on your right.
Thank you, Frith, I said humbly, pretending no longer. I went through then to the little morning room I had not seen before. I was glad to see the dogs there, sitting before the fire, and Jasper, the younger, came over to me at once. I went and sat down at the writing desk. The pigeonholes were docketed, letters, menus, miscellaneous, each ticket written in that same scrawling, pointed hand that I knew already. And it shocked me, even startled me to recognise it, for I had not thought to see it again. And when the telephone rang suddenly, alarmingly, on the desk in front of me, my heart leapt and I started up in terror. "Who is it?" I said. Who do you want?" A voice replied, low and rather harsh. "Mrs. de Winter," it said. "Mrs. de Winter?" "I'm afraid you've made a mistake," I said. "Mrs. de Winter has been dead for over a year." I sat there, waiting, staring stupidly into the mouthpiece. "It's Mrs. Danvers, madam." My faux pas was so palpably obvious, so idiotic and unpardonable, that it must show me to be an even greater fool, if possible, than I seemed already. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, madam. I only wondered whether you wished to see me, and whether you approved of the menus for today." "Oh," I said. "Oh, I'm sure I do. Just order what you like, Mrs. Danvers. You needn't bother to ask me." "Very well, madam," she replied coldly. I heard a little click at the end of the telephone. The morning seemed to drag on endlessly, but when I heard the sound of the car in the drive, I got up in sudden panic, glancing at the clock, for I knew that it meant Beatrice and her husband had arrived. At least I had Maxim to help me.
Here is Beatrice, and this is Giles, and this is Frank Crawley.
Beatrice was tall, broad-shouldered, very handsome, very much like Maxim about the eyes and jaw, but not as smart as I had expected, much tweedier. She did not kiss me. She shook hands firmly, looking me straight in the eyes. Giles stretched out an enormous paw and wrung my hand. Then I turned to the agent, a colourless, rather thin man with a prominent Adam's apple, in whose eyes I read relief as he looked upon me. I wondered why, but I had no time to think of that. Beatrice was talking. "Well, what do you think of Mandalay?" "I've scarcely seen anything of it yet," I answered. "It's beautiful, of course." She was looking me up and down, as I had expected, but in a direct, straightforward fashion, not maliciously like Mrs. Danvers. "You're looking better, old man," she said to Maxim. "I suppose we've got to thank you for that." She nodded at me.
I'm always very fit.
"Bosh," said Beatrice. "You know perfectly well you were a perfect wreck 6 months ago. I thought you were in for a breakdown." I could tell by the tightening of Maxim's muscles under my arm that he was trying to keep his temper. For some reason, this talk about his health was not welcome to him. Mr. Crawley said,
It must have been wonderful in Venice, Mrs. de Winter, at this time of year.
He was saying this to help me. It was his contribution to the little effort of steering the talk away from Maxim's health, and I was grateful to him, feeling him an ally, for all his dull appearance. Beatrice was talking to me again. "Maxim says you paint. That's very nice, of course, but there's no exercise in it, is there?" "I'm very fond of walking, too," I said swiftly. "I'm sure I shall never get tired of rambling about Mandalay. And I can bathe, too, when it's warmer. Is the bathing safe in the bay?" Nobody answered, and I realised suddenly what I'd said. My heart thumped, and I felt my cheeks go flaming red. At that moment the door opened and Frith announced that luncheon was served. We all got up. Beatrice and I a little ahead of the men, she taking my arm. "You know, don't mind me saying so, but you are even younger than I expected. Maxim told me your age, but you're an absolute child. Tell me, are you very much in love with him?" I was not prepared for this question, and she must have seen the surprise on my face, for she laughed lightly and squeezed my arm. "Don't answer," she said. "I can see what you feel. I do hope you will be happy." "Thank you, Beatrice," I said. "Thank you very much." I wondered why she said hoped we would be happy, instead of saying she knew we would be so. She was kind, she was sincere. I liked her very much, but there was a tiny doubt in her voice that made me afraid. "Poor Maxim," she said. "He went through a ghastly time, and let's hope you've made him forget about it." Lunch passed off better than I had dared to hope, though Maxim looked tired, rather jaded. I began to wish none of them had come. It was too much of an effort, just as we returned. When we finally watched the car disappear round the sweep of the drive, Maxim took my arm and said,
Thank God, that's that. Come on, I want to walk.
We set off together, Jasper running in front. We came to a clearing in the woods, and there were 2 paths going in opposite directions. Jasper took the right-hand path without hesitation.
Not that way. Come on, old chap.
The dog looked back at us and stood there wagging his tail, but did not return. Why does he want to go that way?
It leads to a small cove where we used to keep a boat.
We turned into the left-hand path, not saying anything. Jasper followed us. We came to a little narrow cove, the shingle hard and white under our feet, and the sea was breaking on the shore beyond us. Maxim picked up a stone and flung it across the beach for Jasper.
Fetch it, good man.
And Jasper streaked away in search of the stone, his long black ears flapping in the wind. We threw more stones, went to the water's edge and fished for driftwood. The tide had turned and came lapping in the bay. Maxim turned to me, laughing, wiping the hair out of his eyes, and then we looked round and saw that Jasper had disappeared. Maxim called,
Jasper, you idiot, where are you?
In the distance, beyond the rocks, to the right of the beach, I heard a short, sharp bark. I began to move in the direction of the bark.
Come back! We don't want to go that way. The dog knows his own way back.
I pretended not to hear and began scrambling over the rocks towards Jasper. It was heartless of Maxim to leave him, I thought, and I could not understand it. Besides, the tide was coming in. I came up beside another cove, similar to the one I had left. There was a buoy anchored there, but no boat. The woods came right down to the tangle of seaweed marking the high water, and at the fringe of the woods was a long, low building, half cottage, half boathouse. There was a man on the beach in long boots and a sou'wester, and Jasper was barking at him. "Jasper! Jasper, come here!" The dog went on baiting the solitary figure, who looked up at the sound. He smiled at me, showing toothless gums.
"Good day. Dirty, ain't it?"
"Good afternoon," I said. "No, I'm afraid it's not very nice weather." He watched me with interest, smiling all the while. "Have you got any string?" I said. "Something to tie the dog?"
"Eh?"
he said, and he smiled his poor idiot smile. Then he looked at me uncertainly.
"I know that dog. He not yourn?"
I wondered if there was any string in the boathouse, and I walked up the beach towards it. The windows were boarded up, but the door opened after the first stiffness, and I went inside. I expected to find just the usual boat store, but the room was furnished. For a moment I thought it must be inhabited. Perhaps the poor man on the beach lived here. But I looked round me again and saw no sign of recent occupation. No one lived here. No one came here. It was damp and chill, dark and oppressive. I did not like it. A ball of twine lay on the shelf, a rusted clasp knife beside it. I opened the knife, cut a length of twine, and came out of the cottage hurriedly. The man was still watching me, Jasper at his side. As I tied the string loosely round Jasper's collar, the man said,
She don't go in there now. She's gone to the sea, ain't she? She won't come back no more."
"No," I said. "She'll not come back."
I never said nothing, did I?"
"No, of course not. Don't worry," I said, and went across the shingle. I saw Maxim waiting for me. "I'm sorry," I said.
What's the point of being sorry? We're here now.
We went up past the cottage and struck into a path through the woods. It was Jasper's fault. He kept barking at the man. Who was he?
Only Ben. He's quite harmless, poor devil. Where did you get that piece of twine?
I found it in the cottage on the beach.
I told you not to go on those rocks. I never go near the bloody place, or that goddamn cottage. And if you had my memories, you wouldn't want to go there either.
His face was white, and his eyes strained and wretched with that dark, lost look they had when I first met him.
We ought never to have come back to Mandalay. Oh, God, what a fool I was to come back.
We came to the house without a word. The episode was finished. We must not speak of it again. The next day I saw Frank Crawley as I took Jasper for his walk. We chatted, and I said, "I was down on the beach the other day. I'm afraid that cottage place is going to rack and ruin. Why isn't something done about it? It seems such a pity." I knew he would not answer at once. He bent down to tie up his shoelace.
I think if Maxim wanted anything done, he would tell me,
he said, still fumbling with his shoe. "Are they all Rebecca's things?" I asked.
Yes.
"What did she use the cottage for?"
Well, it was a boathouse originally, then she converted it like that and had furniture put in, and china.
I thought it funny the way he called her she. He did not say Rebecca or Mrs. de Winter, as I'd expected him to do. "Did she use it a great deal?"
Yes, she did. Moonlight picnics and one thing and another.
Suddenly, I did not want to ask him any more. I felt sick at myself. My questions had been shameful. Frank Crawley must despise me. "Frank," I said desperately, "I know what you're thinking. You can't understand why I asked all those questions just now. You think I'm morbid and curious. It's not that, I promise you. It's only that sometimes I feel myself at such a disadvantage. It's all very strange to me living here at Mandalay. You see, I know that everyone is thinking the same thing. How different I am to Rebecca."
Mrs. de Winter, please don't think that. For my part, I can't tell you how delighted I am that you have married Maxim. It's perhaps cheeky of me to say so, but I should say that kindness and sincerity, and, if I may say so, modesty are worth far more to a man, to a husband, than all the wit and beauty in the world.
Then he hesitated, his expression still troubled.
I'm sure that Maxim would be very worried, very distressed if he knew how you felt. I don't think he can have any idea of it.
You won't tell him, I said hastily.
No, naturally not. We none of us want to bring back the past. Maxim least of all. And it's up to you, you know, to lead us away from it. Not to take us back there again.
He was right. Of course he was right. Dear, good Frank, my friend, my ally. Frank, I said, before we put an end to this conversation, forever, let's say, will you answer me one thing, quite truthfully? He paused, looking at me a little suspiciously.
I'll do my best.
Tell me, was Rebecca very beautiful? Frank waited a moment, and then he said slowly,
Yes, I suppose she was the most beautiful creature I ever saw in my life.
One afternoon, Maxim had decided to go into Kerrith on some business. I was alone, but decided to take myself out into the sunshine and enjoy the day. As I wandered across the lawn to the terrace, my eye was caught by a gleam of sunshine on some metal. It was the radiator of a car on the drive. It was a long, low car, a sports car. I hesitated at the edge of the lawn, for no reason, perhaps, because the sunlight flickered a moment on the glass. I looked up at the house, and as I did so, I noticed with surprise that the shutters of one of the windows in the west wing had been opened up. Somebody stood by the window, a man, and then he must have caught sight of me because he drew back abruptly, and a figure behind him put an arm up and closed the shutters. The arm belonged to Mrs. Danvers. I recognised the black sleeve. Still, that was nothing to do with me. If she had friends and she took them up to the west wing, it was not exactly my affair. I'd never known it happen before, though. Odd that it should occur on the only day Maxim was from home. Not wanting them to see me, I went up the steps and through the big front door to the hall. It would be awkward if I met them face to face on the stairs, so I darted into the morning room. Directly I did so, I heard voices in the hall. I had thought to remain undiscovered, but it was Jasper who gave me away. He trotted out, wagging his tail.
Hello, you little tyke,
I heard the man say. He wheeled round suddenly and saw me. I have never seen anyone look more astounded.
I beg your pardon.
He was a big, hefty fellow, good-looking in a rather flashy, sunburnt way. I could smell the whiskey on his breath from where I stood. He began to smile.
I hope I haven't startled you.
I came out from behind the door, looking no doubt as big a fool as I felt.
I just popped in to see Danny. She's a very old friend of mine. How's old Max?
I was surprised at his tone. It sounded as though he knew him well. He's very well, thank you. He's gone to Kerrith.
And left the bride all alone. Why, that's too bad. Isn't he afraid someone will come and carry you off?
He laughed, opening his mouth. I did not like his laugh. I did not like him either. Just then Mrs. Danvers came into the room. She turned her eyes upon me and I felt quite cold. Oh, God, I thought. How she must hate me. This is Mr. Favell, madam. She spoke quietly, rather unwillingly. How do you do, I said. Won't you stay to tea? He looked very amused. He turned to Mrs. Danvers.
By heaven, Danny, I've a good mind to.
I saw her flash a look of warning at him.
Well, perhaps you're right. I suppose I'd better be going, hadn't I?
And with that, Mrs. Danvers led him out. I wondered who he was, this man, Favell. He had called Maxim Max. I thought there was only one person who had ever called him Max. I had a sudden, rather terrifying impulse to creep upstairs now to the west wing and go into those rooms and see them for myself. I began to walk upstairs. My heart was beating in a queer, excited way. I found myself in the corridor of the west wing. I selected the door which seemed most likely to be the one I wanted and went inside. My first impression was one of shock. I had expected to see dust sheets, but nothing was covered up. There were brushes and combs on the dressing table, scent and powder. The bed was made up, and there were flowers on the dressing table and on the table beside the bed. A satin dressing gown lay on a chair, and a pair of bedroom slippers beneath. For one desperate moment I thought that something had happened to my brain, that I was seeing back into time, and looking upon the room as it used to be before she died. I realised that my legs were trembling. weak as straw, I was aware of a growing sense of horror, or horror turning to despair. Then I heard a step behind me, and turning round I saw Mrs. Danvers. I shall never forget the expression on her face. Triumphant, gloating, excited in a strange, unhealthy way. I felt very frightened. "Is anything the matter, madam?" I tried to smile at her, and could not. I tried to speak. "Are you feeling unwell?" she said, coming nearer to me, speaking very softly. I backed away from her. I believe if she had come any closer to me, I should have fainted. She smiled, and her manner, instead of being still and unbending as it usually was, became startlingly familiar, fawning even. "Now you are here, let me show you everything," she said, her voice ingratiating and sweet as honey, horrible, false. "I know you want to see it all. It's a lovely room, isn't it? The loveliest room you have ever seen." She took hold of my arm. I could not resist her. I was like a dumb thing. The touch of her hand made me shudder. That was her bed. It's a beautiful bed, isn't it? This was the nightdress she was wearing for the last time before she died. Would you like to touch it? I put it out like this, just as I put it out for her the night she never came back, the night she was drowned. Her fingers tightened on my arm. She bent down to me, her skull's face close, her dark eyes searching mine. The rocks had battered her to bits, you know. Her beautiful face unrecognizable, and both arms gone. Mr. de Winter identified her. You know why Mr. de Winter does not use these rooms any more? Listen to the sea. I forced a smile. I could not speak. My throat felt dry and tight. It's not only this room. I feel her everywhere. You do too, don't you? She stared at me curiously. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes I wonder if she comes back here to Mandalay and watches you and Mr. de Winter together. We stood by the door staring at one another. I could not take my eyes away from hers. How dark and sombre they were in the white skull's face, how malevolent, how full of hatred. She stepped aside for me to pass. I did not speak to her. I went down the stairs blindly and turned the corner and pushed through the door that led to my own rooms. I felt deadly sick as I wondered desperately whether Maxim went, as Mrs. Danvers did, and touched Rebecca's nightdress on the bed. Presently I went downstairs to the library. As I came near, I heard the sound of voices, one raised louder than the other. Maxim's voice. The door was shut. I hesitated a moment before going in.
"I don't care that he was her cousin. You can write and tell him from me to keep away from Mandalay in future, do you hear? I happen to know his car was seen here this afternoon. If you want to meet him, you can meet him outside Mandalay. I won't have him inside the gates, do you understand? Remember, I am warning you for the last time."
I ran swiftly up the stairs and hid in the gallery. Mrs. Danvers came out of the library, shutting the door behind her. Her face was grey with anger, distorted, horrible. It was one Sunday, I remember, when we had an invasion of dreary visitors during the afternoon, that the subject of the fancy dress ball was first brought up. It was Lady Crowan, a tiresome, gushing woman who lived in Kerrith, who introduced the matter. "Oh, Mr. de Winter," she asked, "there is something I've been meaning to ask you for ages. Now tell me, is there any chance of you reviving the Mandalay fancy dress ball?"
"Well, I don't know. It was all rather a business to organise."
He lit a cigarette and his eyes met mine.
"What do you think about it?"
"I don't know," I said uncertainly. "I don't mind." "Of course she longs to have a ball in her honour," gushed Lady Crowan. Maxim still watched me doubtfully. It occurred to me that perhaps he thought I could not face it, that being shy, as he knew only too well, I should find myself unable to cope. I did not want him to think that I should let him down, and so I said, "I think it would be rather fun." Maxim looked away, shrugging his shoulders.
That settles it, of course.
The news soon spread about the fancy dress ball. My little maid, Clarice, her eyes shining with excitement, talked of nothing else. I gathered from her that the servants in general were delighted. "Mr. Frith says it will be like old times. What will you wear, madam?" "I haven't made up my mind, Clarice, but I tell you what, when I do decide, I shall tell you and nobody else. It will be a dead secret between us both." "Oh, madam, how exciting. I don't know how I'm going to wait for the day." The preparations went on for the ball. I began to get in a panic about my costume. It seemed so feeble not to be able to think of anything. One morning, when Mrs. Danvers had brought me the menu to approve, she asked, "Have you decided yet what you will wear, madam?" "No," I said. "No, I haven't decided." She continued watching me. "I wonder you don't copy one of the pictures in the gallery." "Yes, I might think about that," I said. I wondered privately why such an idea had never come to me before. It was an obvious and very good solution to my difficulty. "All the pictures in the gallery would make good costumes, especially that one of the young lady in white, with her hat in her hand." Her voice was surprisingly normal and friendly. Did she want to be friends with me at last? Later on, I went upstairs to the minstrel's gallery to have a look at the pictures. Mrs. Danvers was right, of course. What an idiot I'd been not to think of it before. I always loved the girl in white, with a hat in her hand. I would have it copied faithfully. What a relief it was to have decided at last. I began almost to look forward to the ball. The great day dawned, misty and overcast, but the glass was high and we had no fears. The mist was a good sign. It cleared about 11, and we had a glorious, still summer's day without a cloud in the blue sky. That evening, Clarice helped me to make the final adjustments to my dress. I paraded up and down in front of my glass, watching my reflection. "Go and see if they're all there, Clarice." She obeyed me. "They're all there," she whispered. "Mr. de Winter and Major Mrs. Lacey. Mr. Crawley has just come. They're all standing in the hall." I peered through the archway at the head of the big staircase and looked down on the hall below. Yes, there they were. Giles in a white Arab dress, laughing loudly, showing a knife at his side. Beatrice swathed in an extraordinary green garment and hung about the neck with trailing beads. Poor Frank, self-conscious as a pirate in his striped jersey and sea boots. Maxim, the only normal one of the party, in his evening clothes.
"I don't know what she's doing,"
I heard him say.
"She's been up in her room for hours. What's the time, Frank? The dinner crowd will be upon us before we know where we are."
The band were in the gallery already. "Make the drummer announce me," I whispered to Clarice. "Make him beat the drum. You know how they do. I want to surprise them below." My heart fluttered absurdly and my cheeks were burning. What fun it was. What mad, ridiculous, childish fun. I picked up my skirts in my hands. Then the sound of the drum echoed in the great hall, startling me for a moment. I saw them look up, surprised and bewildered, from the hall below. I came forward to the head of the stairs and stood there, smiling, my hat in my hand, like the girl in the picture. I waited for the clapping and laughter that would follow as I walked slowly down the stairs. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. They all stared at me like dumb things. Beatrice uttered a little cry and put her hand to her mouth. I went on smiling. I put one hand on the banister. "How do you do, Mr. de Winter?" I said. Maxim had not moved. He stared up at me, his glass in his hand. There was no colour in his face. It was ashen white. I saw Frank go to him as though he would speak, but Maxim shook him off. I hesitated, one foot already on the stairs. Something was wrong. They had not understood. Why was Maxim looking like that? Why did they all stand like dummies, like people in a trance? Then Maxim moved forward to the stairs, his eyes never leaving my face.
"What the hell do you think you're doing?"
His eyes blazed in anger. His face was still ashen white. I could not move. I went on standing there, my hand on the banister. "It's the picture," I said, terrified at his eyes, at his voice. "It's the picture, the one in the gallery." There was a long silence. We went on staring at each other. Nobody moved in the hall. I swallowed. My hand moved to my throat. "What is it? What have I done?" If only they would not stare at me like that with dull, blank faces. If only somebody would say something. When Maxim spoke again, I did not recognize his voice. It was still and quiet, icy cold. Not a voice I knew.
"Go and change,"
he said.
"It doesn't matter what you put on. Find an ordinary evening frock, anything will do."
I could not speak. I went on staring at him. His eyes were the only living things in the whole mask of his face.
"What are you standing there for? Didn't you hear what I said?"
I turned and ran blindly through the archway to the corridors beyond. I caught a glimpse of the astonished face of the drummer who had announced me. I brushed past him, stumbling back to the corridor. I looked about me, stunned and stupid like a haunted thing. Then I saw that the door leading to the west wing was open wide, and that someone was standing there. It was Mrs. Danvers. I shall never forget the expression on her face. Loathsome, triumphant. The face of an exulting devil. She stood there, smiling at me. And then I ran from her, down the long, narrow passage to my own room, tripping, stumbling over the flounces of my dress. Clarice was waiting for me in my bedroom. She looked pale and scared. As soon as she saw me, she burst into tears. I began tearing at the hooks of my dress, ripping the stuff. I could not manage them properly, and Clarice came to help me, still crying noisily. "No," I said, "don't bother, I'd rather you went." And Clarice slipped out, still weeping. Then there was a knock at the door. "Who is it?" The door opened and Beatrice came into the room. "My dear," she said. "My dear," and held out her hand to me. "Of course I knew at once it was just a terrible mistake. You could not possibly have known. Why should you?" "Known what?" "Why, the dress, you poor dear. The picture you copied of the girl in the gallery, it was what Rebecca did at the last fancy dress ball at Mandalay. Identical. The same picture, the same dress. You stood there on the stairs, and for one ghastly moment I thought—" All evening Maxim never spoke to me. He never touched me. We stood beside one another, the host and hostess, and we were not together. His eyes looked through me and beyond, cold, expressionless, to a place of pain and torture I could not enter. That night, when the ball was over, Maxim did not come to bed. The next morning I awoke with no illusions. Last night had shown me too well. My marriage was a failure. I was too young for Maxim, too inexperienced. He did not belong to me at all. He belonged to Rebecca. And Mrs. Danvers had meant this to happen. This was her triumph, and Rebecca's. I went along the dark, silent corridor to Rebecca's room. I turned the handle of the door and went inside. Mrs. Danvers was standing by the window, as I knew she would be. She turned to look at me, and I saw her eyes were red and swollen with crying, even as mine were, and there were dark shadows in her white face. I had not expected to find her so. I had pictured her smiling as she had smiled last night, cruel and evil, and now she was none of these things. She was an old woman who was ill and tired. I hesitated, my hand still on the knob of the open door. "You've done what you wanted, haven't you?" I said. "Are you pleased now? Are you happy?" She turned her head away. "Why did you ever come here? Nobody wanted you at Mandalay. We were all right until you came." I did not know what to say. The situation was mad, unreal. "How dare you speak to me like that? How dare you?" I was not afraid of her any more. I went up to her and shook her by the arm. "You made me wear that dress last night. I should never have thought of it but for you. You did it because you wanted to hurt Mr. de Winter. You wanted to make him suffer. Hasn't he suffered enough without your playing that vile, hideous joke upon him? Do you think his agony and pain will bring Mrs. de Winter back again?" She shook herself clear of me. The angry colour flooded her dead white face. "What do I care for his suffering? He's never cared about mine. How do you think I've liked it watching you sit in her place, hearing the servants talking about you as Mrs. de Winter, and all the while, my Mrs. de Winter, my lady with her smile and her lovely face and brave ways, the real Mrs. de Winter, lying dead and cold and forgotten in the church crypt. If he suffers, then he deserves to suffer. Marrying a young girl like you not 10 months afterwards. Well, he's paying for it now, isn't he? I've seen his face. I've seen his eyes." I watched her, fascinated, horrified. A queer, ecstatic smile was on her lips, making her older than ever, making her skull's face vivid and real. She came close to me. She put her face near to mine. "You'll never get the better of her. She's still mistress here, even if she is dead. She's the real Mrs. de Winter, not you. It's you that's the ghost." I backed away from her towards the window, my old fear and horror rising up in me again. She took my arm and held it like a vice. "Why don't you go? We none of us wanted you. He doesn't want you. He never did. It's you who ought to be dead, not Mrs. de Winter." She pushed me towards the open window. I could see the terrace below me, grey and indistinct in the white wall of fog. "Look down there. It's easy, isn't it? Why don't you jump? It wouldn't hurt, not to break your neck. It's a quick, kind way. It's not like drowning. Why don't you try it? Why don't you go?" The fog filled the open window, damp and clammy. It stung my eyes. It clung to my nostrils. I held onto the windowsill with my hands. "Don't be afraid. Why don't you jump now and have done with it? Then you won't be unhappy any more." The fog came thicker than before. There was nothing but the white mist about me, smelling of seaweed, dank and chill. The only reality was the windowsill beneath my hands and the grip of Mrs. Danvers on my left arm. If I jumped, I should not see the stones rise up to meet me. The fog would hide them from me. I shut my eyes. The mist was stifling, like a blanket, like an anesthetic. I was beginning to forget about being unhappy, about loving Maxim. I was beginning to forget about Rebecca. Soon I would not have to think about Rebecca any more. As I relaxed my hands and sighed, the white mist and the silence that was part of it was shattered suddenly, was rent in two by an explosion that shook the window where we stood. I opened my eyes. I stared at Mrs. Danvers. The burst was followed by another, and yet a third and fourth. "What is it?" I said stupidly. "What has happened?" Mrs. Danvers relaxed her grip upon my arm. She stared out of the window into the fog. "It's the rockets," she said. "There must be a ship gone ashore there in the bay." We listened, staring into the white fog together, and then we heard the sound of footsteps running on the terrace beneath. It was Maxim. He was shouting for Frith as he ran.
"She's ashore all right. They'll never shift her, not with these tides. I'm going to the cove to see if I can do anything."
Mrs. Danvers drew back from the window. Her face was expressionless once more. the cold, white mask that I knew. "We had better go down," she said. "When you see Mr. de Winter, madam, will you tell him it will be quite all right if he wants to bring the men back from the ship? There will be a hot meal ready for them any time." "Yes," I said. "Yes, Mrs. Danvers." I went out on the terrace. The fog was lifting. I went down the steep, twisting path through the woods to the beach below. When I came to the cove, I could see the ship at once, lying about 2 miles offshore with her bows pointed towards the cliffs. I climbed up the path over the cliffs. I did not see Maxim anywhere. Frank was there, talking to one of the coast guards. He saw me at once and waved his hand. I went over to him. "Where's Maxim?"
He's taken one of the crew into Careth. The fellow lost his head and jumped for it, apparently, when the ship struck.
"When did he go?"
Well, just before you turned up, about 5 minutes ago.
I did not say anything. He hesitated, and I felt his eyes upon me. I went back inside and sat on the window seat in the library. I was waiting for something to happen, something unforeseen. The horror of my morning and the stranded ship and not eating anything had all combined to give birth to a latent sense of excitement at the back of my mind that I did not understand. It was as though I had entered into a new phase of my life, and nothing would be quite the same again. The girl who had dressed for the fancy dress ball the night before had been left behind. It had all happened a long time ago. Robert came in.
Mr. de Winter is not back yet, is he, madam?
"No. Why? Does someone want him?"
Yes, madam. It's Captain Searle, the harbour master of Careth, on the telephone. He wants to know if he can come up and see Mr. de Winter personally.
"You had better tell him to ring again at 5 o'clock, I said. Robert went out of the room and came back again in a few minutes.
Captain Searle would like to see you, if it would be convenient, madam. He says the matter is rather urgent. He tried to get Mr. Crawley, but there was no reply.
In less than 1/4 hour, he was shown into the room. "I'm sorry, my husband isn't back yet, Captain Searle."
Oh, well, madam, the fact is I've got some news for Mr. de Winter, and I hardly know how to break it to him.
"What sort of news, Captain Searle?"
Well, Mrs. de Winter, it's not very pleasant for me to tell you either. It's hard on him and hard on you that we can't let the past lie quiet. But I don't see how we can under the circumstances. We sent the diver down to inspect the ship's hull, and while he was down there he came across a little sailing boat, lying on her side, quite intact and not broken up at all. It was the little boat belonging to the late Mrs. de Winter.
My first feeling was one of thankfulness that Maxim was not there to hear. This fresh blow coming swiftly upon my masquerade of the night before was ironic and rather horrible. "Is it necessary to tell Mr. de Winter? Couldn't the boat be left there as it is? It's not doing any harm, is it?"
It would be left, Mrs. de Winter, in the ordinary way, but that wasn't all, Mrs. de Winter. There was a body in there, lying on the cabin floor. It was dissolved, of course, no flesh on it, but it was a body, all right.
I stared at him, bewildered at first, then shocked, then rather sick. She was supposed to be sailing alone. There must have been someone with her then, all the time, and no one ever knew.
It looks like it.
Who could it have been? Captain Searle shook his head.
I can't tell any more than you.
The door opened, and Maxim came into the room.
Hello. I didn't know you were here, Captain Searle. Is anything the matter?
I could not stand it any longer. I went out of the room like the coward I was and shut the door behind me. I had not even glanced at Maxim's face. I sat on the terrace and remained there for 5 minutes, staring at the green lawns until I heard the sound of a car starting up in the drive. Captain Searle had broken his news to Maxim and had gone. I ran back to the library. "I'm so sorry. So terribly, terribly sorry." He did not answer. His hand was icy cold. I kissed the back of it, then the fingers, one by one. "I don't want you to bear this alone," I said. "I want to share it with you." He took my face between his hands and looked at me. For the first time I saw how thin his face was, how lined and drawn. And there were great shadows beneath his eyes.
It's too late, my darling. Too late. We've lost our little chance of happiness.
No, Maxim, no.
Yes. It's all over now. The thing has happened. Rebecca has won.
I stared at him, my heart beating strangely.
Her shadow was between us all the time. She knew she'd win in the end. They've found her boat.
Yes, I said. I know. And another body. It means there was somebody sailing with Rebecca at the time, and you have to find out who it was. That's it, isn't it, Maxim?
No. No, you don't understand. There was no one with Rebecca. There never was an accident. Rebecca was not drowned at all. I killed her. I shot Rebecca in the cottage in the cove. I carried her body to the cabin and took the boat out that night and sunk it there where they found it today. It's Rebecca who's lying dead there on the cabin floor.
It was very quiet in the library. When people suffer a great shock, like death or the loss of a limb, I believe they don't feel it just at first. I was aware of no feeling at all. What are you going to do?
I don't know. I don't know.
Disjointed pictures flashed, one by one, through my bewildered mind. Maxim, sitting in the car beside me in the south of France.
Something happened nearly a year ago that altered my whole life. I had to begin living all over again.
Maxim's silence. Maxim's moods. The way he never talked about Rebecca. The way he never mentioned her name. Does anyone know? He shook his head.
No one but you and me.
Why didn't you tell me?
I nearly told you once. That day Jasper ran to the cove and you went to the cottage for some string. You were sitting here like this. And then Frith and Robert came in with the tea.
Yes, I remember. Why didn't you tell me? The time we've wasted when we might have been together. All these weeks and days.
You were so aloof, always wandering into the garden with Jasper, going off on your own. You never came to me like this.
How could I come to you when I knew you were thinking about Rebecca? He pulled me close to him and searched my eyes.
What are you talking about? What do you mean?
Whenever you touched me, I thought you were comparing me to Rebecca.
Oh, my God. You thought I loved Rebecca. You thought I killed her loving her. I hated her, I tell you. Our marriage was a farce from the very first. She was vicious, damnable, rotten through and through. We never loved each other, never had one moment of happiness together. Rebecca was incapable of love, of tenderness, of decency.
I sat on the floor, clasping my knees, staring at him.
She was clever, of course.
He said.
Damnably clever. No one would guess, meeting her, that she was not the kindest, most generous, most gifted person in the world. She knew exactly what to say to different people, how to match her mood to theirs. Had she met you, she'd have walked off into the garden with you, arm in arm, calling to Jasper, chatting about flowers, music, painting, whatever she knew to be your particular hobby, and you'd have been taken in like the rest. You'd have sat at her feet and worshipped her.
Up and down he walked, up and down across the library floor.
When I married her, I was told I was the luckiest man in the world,
he said.
She was so lovely, so accomplished, so amusing. Even Gran, the most difficult person to please in those days, adored her from the first. She's got the 3 things that matter in a wife, she told me. Breeding, brains, and beauty. And I believed her, or forced myself to believe her. But all the time I had a seed of doubt at the back of my mind. There was something about her eyes.
The jigsaw pieces came together piece by piece. The real Rebecca took shape and form before me, stepping from her shadow world like a living figure from a picture frame. Rebecca slashing at her horse, Rebecca seizing life with her 2 hands, Rebecca triumphant, leaning down from the minstrel's gallery with a smile on her lips. Once more I saw myself standing on the beach beside poor startled Ben.
You're kind.
He had grinned.
Not like the other one. You won't put me in the asylum, will you?
There was someone who walked through the woods by night. someone tall and slim. She gave Hugh the feeling of a snake. Maxim was talking, though. Maxim was walking up and down the library floor.
I found her out at once. 5 days after we were married. You remember that time I drove you in the car to the hills above Monte Carlo? I wanted to stand there again, to remember. She sat there, laughing, her black hair blowing in the wind. She told me about herself, told me things I shall never repeat to a living soul. I knew then what I'd done, what I had married. Beauty, brains, and breeding. Oh, my God!
He broke off abruptly. He went and stood by the window, looking out upon the lawns. He began to laugh. He stood there, laughing. I could not bear it. It made me frightened, ill. I could not stand it. "Maxim!" I cried. "Maxim!" He lit a cigarette and stood there smoking, not saying anything. Then he turned away again and paced up and down the room once more.
I nearly killed her then. It would have been so easy. One false step, one slip. You remember the precipice. I frightened you, didn't I? You thought I was mad. Perhaps I was. Perhaps I am. It doesn't make for sanity, does it? Living with the devil.
I sat there watching him. Up and down, up and down.
She made a bargain with me up there on the side of the precipice. "I'll run your house for you," she told me. "I'll look after your precious Manderley for you, make it the most famous showplace in all the country, if you like. And people will visit us and envy us and talk about us, and they'll say we're the luckiest, happiest, handsomest couple in all England. What a leg pull, Max," she said. "What a goddamn triumph." She sat there on the hillside, laughing, tearing a flower to bits in her hands.
Maxim threw his cigarette away. A quarter smoked, into the empty grate.
"I didn't kill her,"
he said.
"I watched her. I said nothing. I let her laugh." We got into the car together and drove away. And she knew I would do as she suggested. Come here to Mandalay, throw the place open, entertain, have our marriage spoken of as the success of the century. She knew I would sacrifice pride, honour, personal feelings, every damned quality on earth, rather than stand before our little world after a week of marriage and have them know the things about her that she'd just told me. She knew I would never stand in a divorce court and give her away. Have fingers pointing at us, mud flung at us in the newspapers, all the people who belong down here whispering when my name was mentioned, all the trippers from Kerrith trooping to the lodge gates, peering into the grounds and saying, "That's where he lives, in there, that's Mandalay. That's the place that belongs to the chap who had the divorce case we read about. Do you remember what the judge said about his wife?"
He came and stood before me. He held out his hands.
"You despise me, don't you?"
he said.
"You can't understand my shame and loathing and disgust."
I did not say anything. I held his hands against my heart. I did not care about his shame. None of the things that he had told me mattered to me at all. I clung to one thing only and repeated it to myself over and over again. Maxim did not love Rebecca. He had never loved her. Never, never. They had never known one moment's happiness together. Maxim was talking, and I listened to him, but his words meant nothing to me. I did not really care.
I thought about Mandalay too much. I put Mandalay first before anything else. And it doesn't prosper, that sort of love. They don't preach about it in the churches. Christ said nothing about stones and bricks and walls, the love that a man can bear for his plot of earth, his soil, his little kingdom. It does not come into the Christian creed.
"My darling," I said. "My Maxim. My love." I laid his hands against my face. I put my lips against them.
"Do you understand?"
he said.
"Do you? Do you?"
"Yes," I said. "My sweet, my love." But I looked away from him so he should not see my face. What did it matter whether I understood him or not? My heart was light like a feather floating in the air. He had never loved Rebecca.
I don't want to look back on those years,
he said slowly.
I don't want even to tell you about them. The shame and the degradation. The lie we lived, she and I. The shabby, sordid farce we played together. Before friends, before relations, even before the servants, before faithful, trusting creatures like old Frith. They all believed in her down here. They all admired her. They never knew how she laughed at them behind their backs, jeered at them, mimicked them. I can remember days when the place was full for some show or other, a garden party, a pageant, and she walked about with a smile like an angel on her face, her arm through mine, giving prizes afterwards to a little troop of children. And then the day afterwards she would be up at dawn driving to London, streaking to that flat of hers by the river like an animal to its hole in the ditch, coming back here at the weekend after 5 unspeakable days. Oh, I kept my side of the bargain all right. I never gave her away. Her blasted taste made Mandalay the thing it is today. The gardens, the shrubs, the azaleas. Do you think they existed when my father was alive? God, the place was a wilderness. Lovely, yes, wild and lonely with a beauty of its own, yes, but crying out for skill and care and the money that he would never give it, that I would not have thought to give it, but for Rebecca. Half the stuff you see in the rooms was never here originally. The drawing room, as it is today, the morning room, that's all Rebecca. Those chairs that Frith points out so proudly to the visitors on the public day, and that panel of tapestry. Rebecca again. Oh, some of the things were here, admittedly, stored away in back rooms. My father knew nothing about furniture or pictures, but the majority was bought by Rebecca. The beauty of Mandalay that you see today, the Mandalay that people talk about and photograph and paint, is all due to her, to Rebecca.
I did not say anything. I held him close. I wanted him to go on talking like this, that his bitterness might loosen and come away, carrying with it all the pent-up hatred and disgust and muck of the lost years.
And so we lived,
he said.
Month after month, year after year. I accepted everything, because of Mandalay. What she did in London didn't touch me, because it didn't touch Mandalay. And she was careful those first years. There was never a murmur about her, never a whisper. Then, little by little, she began to grow careless. You know how a man starts drinking. He goes easy at first, just a little at a time, a bad bout every 5 months or so. And then the period grows less and less. Soon it's every month, every fortnight, every few days. There's no margin of safety left, and all his secret cunning goes. It was like that with Rebecca. She began to ask her friends down here. She would have 1 or 2 of them and mix them up at a weekend house party, so that at first I was not quite sure, not quite certain. She would have picnics down at her cottage in the Cove. I came back once, having been away shooting in Scotland, and found her there with 6 of them, people I'd never seen before. I warned her, and she shrugged her shoulders. "What the hell's it got to do with you?" she said. I told her she could see her friends in London, but Mandalay was mine. She must stick to that part of the bargain. She smiled. She didn't say anything. Then she started on Frank. Poor, shy, faithful Frank. He came to me one day and said he wanted to leave Mandalay and take another job. We argued for 2 hours here in the library, and then I understood. He broke down and told me. She never let him alone, he said. She was always going down to his house, trying to get him to the cottage. Dear, wretched Frank, who had not understood, who had always thought we were the normal, happy married couple we pretended to be. I accused Rebecca of this, and she flared up at once, cursing me, using every filthy word in her particular vocabulary. We had a sickening, loathsome scene. She went up to London after that and stayed there for a month. When she came back, she was quiet at first. I thought she'd learnt her lesson. Bea and Giles came for a weekend, and I realised then what I had sometimes suspected before, that Bea didn't like Rebecca. I believe in her funny, abrupt, downright way she saw through her, guessed something was wrong. It was a tricky, nervy sort of weekend. Giles went out sailing with Rebecca. Bea and I lazed on the lawn. And when they came back, I could tell by Giles's rather hearty, jovial manner, and by a look in Rebecca's eye, that she'd started on him, as she had done on Frank. I saw Bea watching Giles at dinner, who laughed louder than usual, talked a little too much, and all the while Rebecca sitting there at the head of the table, looking like an angel.
They were all fitting into place, the jigsaw pieces, the odd, strange shapes that I'd tried to piece together with my fumbling fingers, and they had never fitted. The silence that I'd always taken for sympathy and regret was silence born of shame and embarrassment. It seemed incredible to me now that I had never understood. I wondered how many people there were in the world who suffered and continued to suffer because they could not break out of their own web of shyness and reserve, and in their blindness and folly built up a great distorted wall in front of them that hid the truth. This was what I had done. I had built up false pictures in my mind and sat before them. I never had the courage to demand the truth. Had I made one step forward out of my own shyness, Maxim would have told me these things 4 months ago, 5 months ago.
Rebecca grew cunning again. Her behaviour was faultless outwardly, but if I happened to be away when she was here at Mandalay, I could never be certain what might happen. There had been Frank and Giles. She might get hold of one of the workmen on the estate, someone from Kerrith, anyone, and then the bomb would have to fall. The gossip, the publicity I dreaded.
It seemed to me I stood again by the cottage in the woods, and I heard the drip, drip of the rain upon the roof. I saw the dust on the model ships, the rat holes on the divan. I saw Ben with his poor staring idiot's eyes, and I thought of the dark, steep path through the woods, and how if a woman stood there behind the trees, her evening dress would rustle in the thin night breeze.
She had a cousin,
said Maxim slowly.
A fellow who'd been abroad and was living in England again. He took to coming here, if I was ever away. Frank used to see him. A fellow called Jack Favell.
I know him, I said. He came here the day you went to London.
You saw him too? Why didn't you tell me? I heard it from Frank, who saw his car turn in at the lodge gates.
I did not like to, I said. I thought it would remind you of Rebecca.
Remind me?
Whispered Maxim.
Oh, God, as if I needed reminding.
He stared in front of him, breaking off from his story, and I wondered if he was thinking, as I was, of that flooded cabin beneath the waters in the bay.
She used to have this fellow Favell down to the cottage,
said Maxim.
She would tell the servant she was going to sail and wouldn't come back before the morning. Then she'd spend the night down there with him. Once again I warned her. I said if I found him there, anywhere on the estate, I'd shoot him. He had a black, filthy record. The very thought of him walking about the woods in Mandalay made me mad. I told her I wouldn't stand for it. She shrugged her shoulders. She forgot to blaspheme. And I noticed she was looking paler than usual, nervy, rather haggard. I wondered then what the hell would happen to her when she began to look old. Feel old. Things drifted on. Nothing very much happened. Then one day she went up to London and came back again the same day, which she didn't do as a rule. I didn't expect her. I dined that night with Frank at his house. We had a lot of work on at the time.
He was speaking now in short, jerky sentences. I had his hands very tightly between my 2 hands.
I came back after dinner about 10:30, and I saw her scarf and gloves lying on a chair in the hall. I wondered what the devil she'd come back for. I went into the morning room, but she wasn't there. I guess she'd gone off then down to the cove. And I knew then that I couldn't stand this life of lies and filth and deceit any longer. The thing had got to be settled one way or the other. I thought I'd take a gun and frighten the fellow. Frighten them both. I went down right away to the cottage. The servants never knew I'd come back to the house at all. I slipped out into the garden and through the woods. I saw the light in the cottage window and I went straight in. To my surprise, Rebecca was alone. She was lying on the divan with an ashtray full of cigarette stubs beside her. She looked ill. Queer. I began at once about Favell, and she listened to me without a word. "We've lived this life of degradation long enough, you and I," I said. "This is the end, do you understand? What you do in London doesn't concern me. You can live with Favell there, or with anyone you like, but not here. Not at Mandalay." She said nothing for a moment. She stared at me and then she smiled. "Suppose it suits me better to live here. What then?" she said. "You know the conditions," I said. "I've kept my part of our dirty, damnable bargain, haven't I? But you've cheated. You think you can treat my house and my home like your own sink in London. I've stood enough, but my God, Rebecca, this is your last chance." I remember she squashed out her cigarette in the tub by the divan, and then she got up and stretched herself, her arms above her head. "You're right, Max," she said. "It's time I turned over a new leaf." She looked very pale, very thin. She began walking up and down the room, her hands in the pockets of her trousers. She looked like a boy in her sailing kit, a boy with the face of a Botticelli angel. "Have you ever thought," she said, "how damned hard it would be for you to make a case against me, in a court of law, I mean, if you wanted to divorce me? Do you realise that you've never had one shred of proof against me from the very first? All your friends, even the servants, believe our marriage to be a success." "What about Frank?" I said. "What about Beatrice?" She threw back her head and laughed. "What sort of a story could Frank tell against mine?" she said. "Don't you know me well enough for that? As for Beatrice, wouldn't it be the easiest thing in the world for her to stand in a witness box as the ordinary jealous woman whose husband once lost his head and made a fool of himself? Oh, no, Max. You'd have a hell of a time trying to prove anything against me." She stood watching me, rocking on her heels, her hands in her pockets and a smile on her face. "Do you realise that I could get Danny as my personal maid to swear anything I asked her to swear in a court of law? And that the rest of the servants, in blind ignorance, would follow her example and swear too? They think we live together at Mandalay as husband and wife, don't they? And so does everyone, your friends, all our little world. Well, how are you going to prove that we don't?" She sat down on the edge of the table, swinging her legs, watching me. "Haven't we acted the parts of loving husband and wife rather too well?" she said. I remember watching that foot of hers in its striped sandal, swinging backwards and forwards, and my eyes and brain began to burn in a strange, quick way. "We could make you look very foolish, Danny and I," she said softly. "We could make you look so foolish that no one would believe you, Max. Nobody at all." Still that foot of hers, swinging to and fro, that damned foot in its blue and white striped sandal. Suddenly, she slipped off the table and stood in front of me, smiling still, her hands in her pockets. "If I had a child, Max," she said, "neither you nor anyone in the world could ever prove that it wasn't yours. It would grow up here at Mandalay, bearing your name. There would be nothing you could do. And when you died, Mandalay would be his. You couldn't prevent it. The property's entailed. You'd like an heir, wouldn't you, for your beloved Mandalay? You would enjoy it, wouldn't you? Seeing my son lying in his pram under the chestnut tree, playing leapfrog on the lawn and catching butterflies. It would give you the biggest thrill of your life, wouldn't it, Max? To watch my son grow bigger day by day, and to know that when you died, all this would be his." She waited a minute, rocking on her heels, and then she lit a cigarette and went and stood by the window. She began to laugh. She went on laughing. I thought she'd never stop. "God, how funny," she said. "How supremely, wonderfully funny. Well, you heard me say I was going to turn over a new leaf, didn't you? Now you know the reason." They'll be happy, won't they? All these smug locals, all your blasted tenants. "It's what we've always hoped for, Mrs. de Winter," they'll say. "I'll be the perfect mother, Max, like I've been the perfect wife. And none of them will ever guess, none of them will ever know." She turned round and faced me, smiling, one hand in her pocket, the other holding her cigarette. When I killed her, she was smiling still. I fired at her heart. The bullet passed right through, She didn't fall at once. She stood there looking at me. That slow smile on her face. Her eyes wide open.
Maxim's voice had sunk low. So low that it was like a whisper. The hand that I held between my own was cold. I did not look at him. I watched Jasper's sleeping body on the carpet beside me, the little thump of his tail now and then upon the floor.
"I'd forgotten,"
said Maxim, and his voice was slow now, tired, without expression.
"that when you shoot a person there was so much blood."
There was a hole there on the carpet beneath Jasper's tail. The burnt hole from a cigarette. I wondered how long it had been there. Some people said ash was good for the carpets,
"I had to get water from the cove,"
said Maxim.
"I had to keep going backwards and forwards to the cove for water. Even by the fireplace where she'd not been there was a stain. It was all round where she lay on the floor. It began to blow too. There was no catch on the window. The window kept banging backwards and forwards while I knelt there on the floor with that dishcloth and the bucket beside me. I carried her out to the boat. It must have been 11:30 by then, nearly 12. It was quite dark. There was no moon. Then I had to get under way, with the dinghy astern, and beat out of the little harbour against the tide. The wind was with me, but it came in puffs, and I was in the lee there, under the cover of the headland. I remember I got the mainsail jammed halfway up the mast. I hadn't done it, you see, for a long time. I never went out with Rebecca. And I thought of the tide, how swift it ran, and how strong into the little cove. The wind blew down from the headland like a funnel. I got the boat out into the bay. I got her out there beyond the beacon, and I tried to go about, to clear the ridge of the rocks. We began to drift sideways closer to the ridge. It was dark, so damn dark I couldn't see anything on that black, slippery deck. Somehow I blundered down into the cabin. I had a spike with me. If I didn't do it now, it would be too late. We were getting so near to the ridge, and in 6 or 7 minutes, drifting like this, we should be out of deep water. I opened the sea cocks. The water began to come in. I drove the spike into the bottom boards. One of the planks split right across. I took the spike out and began to drive in another plank. The water came up over my feet. I left Rebecca lying on the floor. I fastened both the scuttles. I bolted the door. When I came up on deck, I saw we were within 20 yards of the ridge. I threw some of the loose stuff on the deck into the water. There was a life buoy, a pair of sweeps, a coil of rope. I climbed into the dinghy. I pulled away and lay back on the paddles and watched. The boat was drifting still. She was sinking too, sinking by the head. The jib was still shaking and cracking like a whip. I thought someone must hear it, someone walking on the cliffs late at night, some fisherman from Kerrith, way beyond me in the bay, whose boat I couldn't see. The boat was smaller, like a black shadow on the water. The mast began to shiver, began to crack. Suddenly she heeled right over, and as she went the mast broke in two, split right down the centre. The lifebuoy and the sweeps floated away from me on the water. The boat wasn't there anymore. I remember staring at the place where she had been. Then I pulled back to the cove. It started raining.
Maxim waited. He stared in front of him still. Then he looked at me, sitting beside him on the floor.
"That's all,"
he said.
"There's no more to tell."
Rebecca is dead, I said. That's what we've got to remember. Rebecca is dead. She can't speak. She can't bear witness. She can't harm you any more.
"There's her body,"
he said.
"The diver has seen it. It's lying there on the cabin floor."
If they find out it's Rebecca, you must say the other body was a mistake. You must say that the body in the crypt was a mistake, a ghastly mistake. You must say that when you went to Edgecombe you were ill. You did not know what you were doing. You were not sure even then. You could not tell. It was a mistake, just a mistake. You will say that, won't you?
Yes.
He said.
Yes.
They can't prove anything against you, I said. Nobody saw you that night. You had gone to bed. They can't prove anything. No one knows but you and I. No one at all, not even Frank. We are the only two people in the world to know, Maxim. You and I.
Yes.
He said.
Yes.
They will think the boat capsized and sank when she was in the cabin, I said. They will think she went below for a rope for something, and while she was there the wind came from the headland, and the boat heeled over, and Rebecca was trapped. They'll think that, won't they?
I don't know.
He said.
I don't know.
Suddenly the telephone began ringing in the little room behind the library. Maxim went into the little room and shut the door. I had a sick, expectant feeling at the pit of my stomach. Maxim came back into the room.
It was Colonel Julian. He's just been talking to Searle. He's coming out with us to the boat tomorrow. Searle's told him.
Why Colonel Julian? Why?
He's the magistrate for Kerrith. He has to be present. Inspector Welsh, too.
Why? Why Inspector Welsh?
It's the custom when a body's been found.
Maxim rose early next morning and left without waking me. I spent my morning as busily as I could. At 1:05 I heard the sound of a car in the drive, and then voices in the hall. Maxim came in, and Frank, and Colonel Julian. The Colonel spoke quietly, gravely, like a doctor.
This is a most distressing thing, Mrs. de Winter. I do feel for you and your husband most acutely.
To Maxim, he said.
What makes it so difficult was the fact of your identifying the first body over a year ago.
Frank said quickly.
I think the mistake was very natural under the circumstances. The authorities wrote to Maxim presupposing that the body was hers, and Maxim wasn't well at the time. That's nonsense. I was perfectly well.
Colonel Julian said.
Well, it's no use going into all that now. You've made that first identification to Winter, and now the only thing to do is to admit the error. There seems to be no doubt about it this time. No. I just wish you could be spared the formality and the publicity of an inquest, but I'm afraid that's quite impossible. Naturally. I don't think it'll take very long, but it has to be done. No, what bothers me is the wretched publicity of the affair, so sad and unpleasant for you and your wife.
That evening, when Frith brought in the local paper, there were great headlines right across the top of the page, and an awful blurred photograph of Maxim that must have been at least 15 years old. It was dreadful seeing it there on the front page, staring at me. The story was in the London papers too. I thought of all the things they could say if they knew the truth. Not one column, but 5 or 6. Newsboys shouting in the streets, outside the underground stations. The inquest was to be held at Lanyon, the market town 6 miles the other side of Kerrith. We had to park the cars in the big cobbled square by the marketplace. Dr. Phillips' car was there already, and also Colonel Julian's. I think I shall stay here, I said. I don't think I'll come in with you after all. They went off together and left me sitting in the car. The minutes went by. I got out of the car, and in spite of myself I found I was coming to the building where the inquest was being held. I saw a policeman watching me curiously from the door.
Excuse me, madam. Aren't you Mrs. de Winter?
Yes. How long will they be?
I'll go and inquire if you like.
He disappeared along the passage. In a moment he came back again.
Mr. de Winter has just given his evidence. Captain Searle and the diver and Dr. Phillips have already given theirs. There's only one more to speak. Mr. Tabb, the boat builder from Kerrith. Perhaps you'd like to hear the remaining evidence. There is a seat just there, inside the door.
Yes, I said. Yes, I think I will. I slipped in and sat down just by the door. My heart gave a jump suddenly as I recognised Mrs. Danvers. She was sitting right at the back, and Favell was beside her. Jack Favell, Rebecca's cousin. James Tabb, the boat builder, was standing up now, and the coroner was asking a question.
Yes, sir. I converted Mrs. de Winter's little boat. She gave me the job of doing her up like a little yacht. Was the boat in a fit state to put to sea? She was. Has the boat ever been known to capsize before? No, sir. She was a stout seaworthy boat and could stand a lot of wind. Mrs. de Winter had sailed her in worse weather than she ever found that night. That's what I've said all along. I can't understand Mrs. de Winter's boat being lost on a night like that. But surely, if Mrs. de Winter went below for a coat, as is supposed, and a sudden puff of wind was to come down from the headland, it would be enough to capsize the boat.
James Tabb shook his head.
No, I don't see that it would. I went and looked at the boat yesterday. Captain Searle himself gave me permission. There was nothing wrong with that boat as regards the work I did to her. She was lying on sand, and there wasn't a mark of rock on her. So, what I want to know is this. Who drove the holes in her planking? Rocks didn't do it. There were holes, done with a spike. And that's not all. The seacocks have been turned on, and they're always kept tight closed when you're under way, otherwise the water would flow in. When I examined the boat yesterday, both seacocks were turned full on. It's my opinion, sir, that the boat never capsized at all. She was deliberately scuttled.
Someone in front of me stood up, and they were talking, too. They were all talking. The coroner was asking everybody to be silent.
Mr. de Winter, you heard the statement from James Tabb, who had the care of Mrs. de Winter's boat. Do you know anything of these holes driven in the planking? Nothing whatever. Can you think of any reason why they should be there? No, of course not. It's the first time you've heard them mentioned? Yes, of course it is. Well, who looked after Mrs. de Winter's boat? She looked after it herself. The boat was moored in the private harbour belonging to Mandalay? Yes. Any stranger who tried to tamper with the boat would be seen. There's no access to the harbour by public footpath? None at all. Therefore, we must assume that whoever took the boat out that night drove in the planking and opened the seacocks. I suppose so. You have told us already that the door of the cabin was shut, the portholes closed, and your wife's remains were on the floor. This was in your statement, and in Dr. Phillips', and in Captain Searle's. Yes. And now, added to this is the information that a spike was driven through the bottom and the seacocks were open. Does this not strike you, Mr. de Winter, as being very strange? Certainly. You've no suggestion to make? No, none at all. Mr. de Winter, painful as it may be, it's my duty to ask you a very personal question. Yes. Were relations between you and the late Mrs. de Winter perfectly happy?
They had to come, of course. Those black spots in front of my eyes, dancing, flickering, stabbing the hazy air. And it was hot, so hot, with all these people, all these faces, and no open window. The door, from being near me, was farther away than I had thought, and all the time the ground coming up to meet me. And then, out of the queer mist around me, Maxim's voice, clear and strong.
Will someone take my wife outside? She's going to faint.
I was sitting in a little room. The policeman was there, bending over me, giving me a glass of water. And someone's hand was on my arm. Frank's hand.
Maxim told me to take you back to Manderley. Can you walk as far as the car, or shall I bring it round?
I can walk, but I'd much rather stay. I want to wait for Maxim.
Maxim will be a long time.
Why will they be a long time? What are they going to do?
Well, they may have to go over the evidence again. They won't believe in an accident anymore.
We drove back to Mandalay in silence.
Will you be all right now?
Said Frank.
I shall go back to Lanyon. Maxim may want me.
He did not say anything more. He got quickly back into the car again and drove off. I must have fallen asleep in the library because I woke suddenly with a start and heard that first crack of thunder in the air. I sat up. The clock said 5. Robert came into the room.
The car has just driven up to the door now, madam.
Which car?
Mr. de Winter's car, madam.
Is Mr. de Winter driving it himself?
Yes, madam.
I tried to get up. My legs were things of straw. They would not bear me. After a minute, Maxim came into the room. He looked very tired, old. There were lines at the corner of his mouth I had never noticed before.
It's all over.
I waited. I could not move towards him.
Suicide,
he said. Later that evening, when Maxim was resting before dinner, Frith came to me in the library.
"Excuse me, madam. There's a gentleman to see Mr. de Winter, madam."
"Who is it?" I said. Frith looked uncomfortable.
"It's a gentleman who used to come here frequently at one time when Mrs. de Winter was alive. A gentleman called Mr. Favell."
"I think perhaps I'd better see him," I said.
"Very good, madam."
In a few moments, Frith returned and showed Favell into the library. He looked much the same as before, but a little rougher, if possible, a little more untidy.
"This business has been a shock to me, you'll know. A bloody awful shock. Rebecca was my cousin. I was damn fond of her."
"Yes," I said. "I'm very sorry for you."
"I'm going to see justice is done to Rebecca. Suicide! God almighty! That doddering old fool of a coroner. You and I know it wasn't suicide, don't we? Don't we?"
The door opened, and Maxim came into the room, with Frank just behind him. Maxim stood quite still, with the door open, staring at Favell.
"What the hell are you doing here?"
Favell waited a moment, and then he began to smile.
"As a matter of fact, Max, old chap, I came to congratulate you on the inquest this afternoon."
Maxim did not move. I saw Frank close the door very quietly.
"You realise, don't you, that I can make things damned unpleasant for you if I choose? Not only unpleasant, but shall I say, dangerous?"
Still, Maxim did not move. He never took his eyes off Favell.
"Oh, yes. In what way can you make things dangerous?" "I suppose there are no secrets between you and your wife, and from the look of things, Crawley there just makes the happy trio. You all know about Rebecca and me. We were lovers, weren't we? I've never denied it, and I never will. Very well, then. But you never knew I had this note, did you? I kept it, because it was the last thing she ever wrote to me. I'll read it to you."
He took a piece of paper out of his pocket. I recognised that thin, pointed, slanting hand.
"I tried to ring you from the flat, but could get no answer. I'm going down to Manders right away. I shall be at the cottage this evening, and if you get this in time, will you get the car and follow me? I'll spend the night at the cottage and leave the door open for you. I've got something to tell you, and I want to see you as soon as possible. Rebecca."
He put the note back in his pocket.
"Now, that's not the sort of note you write when you're going to commit suicide, is it? It was waiting for me at my flat when I got back about 4 in the morning. I telephoned the following morning and heard Rebecca had been drowned."
None of us spoke.
"Now, Max, I've laid all my cards on the table. Why can't we come to some agreement? If I had a settlement of 2,000 or 3,000 a year for life, I could jog along quite comfortably, and I'd never trouble you again. I swear before God I would not."
Maxim finally replied.
"You think you can frighten me, don't you, Favell? Well, you're wrong. I'm not afraid of anything you can do. There's the telephone in the next room. Shall I ring up Colonel Julian and ask him to come over? He's the magistrate. He'll be interested in your story."
Favell stared at him and laughed.
"Good bluff, Max, but it won't work. You wouldn't dare ring up old Julian. I've got enough evidence to hang you, old man."
Maxim walked slowly across the room and passed through to the little room beyond. I heard the click of the telephone. I heard Maxim's voice, very cool, very calm. He came back into the room.
"Julian is coming right away."
Presently, Colonel Julian arrived, and Frith showed him into the room. Maxim nodded to him.
"I think you realise that I haven't brought you out on an evening like this for a social half-hour before dinner. This is Jack Favell, my late wife's first cousin. Go ahead, Favell."
Favell stared at him a moment. He put his hand slowly in the waistcoat pocket and brought out Rebecca's note.
"This note was written a few hours before Rebecca was supposed to have set out on that suicide sail. Here it is. I want you to read it and say whether you think a woman who wrote that note had made up her mind to kill herself."
Colonel Julian took a pair of spectacles from a case in his pocket and read the note. Then he handed it back to Favell and said,
"No, on the face of it, no, but I don't know what the note refers to. Perhaps you do, or perhaps de Winter does."
Maxim did not say anything. Favell twisted the piece of paper in his fingers.
"My cousin made a definite appointment in that note, didn't she? She deliberately asked me to drive down to Mandalay that night because she had something to tell me.
He turned his head and looked slowly towards Maxim.
Rebecca never committed suicide. Max de Winter murdered Rebecca, and I'm going to prove it.
Colonel Julian said quietly,
Wait a minute, Mr. Favell. Why didn't you produce that letter in court?
Favell stared at him and laughed.
Why? Because I didn't choose to, that's why. I prefer to come and tackle de Winter personally. I tell you, he killed Rebecca because of me. He knew I was her lover. He was jealous, madly jealous. He knew she was waiting for me at the cottage on the beach, and he went down that night and killed her. Then he put her body in the boat and sank her. Quite a clever story, Favell, in its way, but you have no proof. You can't produce one shred of evidence against de Winter, and you know it. You can't even prove your own story, can you? Can't I?
I saw Favell smile. He came across to the fireplace and rang the bell. I guessed already what was going to happen. Frith answered the bell.
Ask Mrs. Danvers to come here.
Frith glanced at Maxim. Maxim nodded shortly, and Frith left. We all waited, watching the door. Then Mrs. Danvers came into the room. Colonel Julian addressed her.
I want to ask you a question, and the question is this. Were you aware of the relationship between the late Mrs. de Winter and Mr. Favell here?
They were first cousins.
I was not referring to blood relationships, Mrs. Danvers.
I'm afraid I don't understand, sir.
Oh, come of it, Danny, you know damn well what he's driving at. I've told Colonel Julian already, but he doesn't seem to believe me. Rebecca and I had lived together off and on for years, hadn't we? She was in love with me, wasn't she?
To my surprise, Mrs. Danvers considered him for a moment without speaking, and there was something of scorn in the glance she gave him. She was not.
Listen here, you old fool.
She was not in love with you or Mr. de Winter. She was not in love with anyone. She despised all men. She was above all that. Favell flushed angrily.
Listen here, didn't she come down the path through the woods to meet me night after night? Didn't you wait up for her? Didn't she spend the weekends with me in London?
Well, and what if she did? She had a right to amuse herself, hadn't she? Love-making was a game with her, only a game. She told me so. She did it because it made her laugh. It made her laugh, I tell you. She laughed at you like she did at the rest. I've known her come back and sit upstairs in her bed and rock with laughter at the lot of you. There was something horrible in the sudden torrent of words. Something horrible and unexpected. Then Colonel Julian spoke, quietly and softly.
Mrs. Danvers, can you think of any reason, however remote, why Mrs. de Winter should have taken her own life?
Mrs. Danvers shook her head. No. Favell said swiftly,
There, you see.
Colonel Julian directed Favell to produce the note again. Favell shrugged his shoulders. He felt in his pocket for the note and threw it on the floor at Mrs. Danvers' feet. She stooped and picked it up. We watched her lips move as she read the words. Then she shook her head. I don't know what she meant. If there was something important she had to tell Mr. Jack, she would have told me first.
You never saw her that night?
No. I was out.
Then you know nothing of her mind, Mrs. Danvers. Those words, I have something to tell you, do not convey anything to you at all.
No.
Does anybody know how she spent that day in London?
Nobody answered. Maxim shook his head. Favell swore under his breath.
Look here. She left that note at my flat at 3 in the afternoon. The porter saw her.
Mrs. Danvers said, Mrs. de Winter had a hair appointment from 12 until 1:30. I remember that.
So, what was she doing from 1:30 until 3? We ought to verify that,
said Colonel Julian. I've got her engagement diary locked in my room, said Mrs. Danvers slowly. I kept all those things. It's just possible she may have noted down her appointments for that day.
Do you mind us seeing this diary?
Colonel Julian asked Maxim.
Of course not. Why on earth should I?
Mrs. Danvers returned swiftly with the diary. She gave it to Colonel Julian. It seemed to me then that there was something about that particular moment, while he looked at the page of the diary, and we stood waiting, that frightened me more than anything that had happened that evening.
Ah, here it is. Hair at 12, as Mrs. Danvers said. Lunch at the club. And what have we here, though? Baker, 2 o'clock. Who was Baker?
He looked at Maxim. Maxim shook his head. Then at Mrs. Danvers. She knew no one called Baker. I've never heard the name before.
Well, here it is,
said Colonel Julian, handing her the diary.
You can see for yourself. Baker.
Mrs. Danvers had the book in her hands and was turning the leaves. Suddenly she gave an exclamation. There's something here, right at the back among the telephone numbers, Baker, and there's a number, 0488. But there's no exchange, just an M beside it. Favell jeered.
Oh, try every exchange in London. Try Mayfair. Try museum. Max doesn't care if his telephone bill is £1,000, do you, Max? You want to play for time, and so should I if I were you.
Maxim lighted his first cigarette.
Something had better be done about it. Frank, go through and ask the exchange for those numbers.
Frank went through to the little room beyond. Favell gave a cackle of laughter.
Carry on, Detective Number 1.
After 5 minutes, Frank returned.
Museum 0488 is an address in Bloomsbury. The night porter said there were no residents there at all, but the place is used during the day as a doctor's consulting rooms. Apparently Baker's given up practice and left 6 months ago. But we can get hold of him all right. The porter gave me his address.
It was then that Maxim looked at me. He looked at me for the first time that evening, and in his eyes I read a message of farewell. Then he turned to Frank.
Well done. What's the address? Somewhere near Barnet, north of London,
said Frank, giving him a slip of paper.
But it's not on the telephone. We can't ring him up. We'll have to drive down.
Colonel Julian said,
Satisfactory work, Crawley. Mrs. Danvers, can you throw any light on the matter now?
Mrs. Danvers shook her head. Mrs. de Winter never needed a doctor. Favell said,
The note and that appointment seem to hang together. But what the hell was it all about? That's what I want to know. What was the matter with her?
The truth screamed in their faces, and they did not see. They all stood there, staring at one another, and they did not understand. The next morning, we set out for London. Maxim drove, and I sat beside him. The Colonel sat in the back. Behind us drove Favell in his own car. We came to the suburbs at about 3 o'clock. The drive through London seemed endless, and by the time we had drawn clear again and were out beyond Hampstead, there was a sound in my head like the beating of a drum, and my eyes were burning. Maxim was pale, and there were shadows under his eyes, but he did not say anything. The Colonel drew out a large-scale map from his coat pocket and began directing Maxim to Barnet. It was a postman who pointed out the house in the end. We drew up and got out of the car. Favell strolled up to meet us. We walked up the drive to the front door. A strange, incongruous little party. Colonel Julian rang the bell. It tinkled somewhere in the back premises. There was a long pause. A very young maid opened the door to us. She looked startled at the sight of so many of us.
Dr. Baker,
said Colonel Julian. Yes, sir. Will you come in? And she showed us into the drawing room. We waited there for about 5 minutes. Then the door opened and a man came into the room, looking a little surprised.
Won't you sit down?
He turned to me. I sat down in the nearest chair and waited.
You must think this is a very unorthodox invasion, Dr. Baker, and I apologise very humbly for disturbing you like this. My name is Julian. This is Mr. de Winter, and Mrs. de Winter, and Mr. Favell, who may have seen Mr. de Winter's name in the papers recently. Oh, yes. Yes, I suppose I have. Some inquest or other, wasn't it? My wife was reading all about it.
Maxim turned to the doctor.
We've driven up to see you today because we found your name and the telephone number of your old consulting rooms in my wife's engagement diary. She seems to have made an appointment with you and kept it at 2 o'clock on the last day she ever spent in London. Could you possibly verify this for us?
Dr. Baker was listening with great interest. But when Maxim had finished, he shook his head.
I'm most awfully sorry, but I think you've made a mistake. I should have remembered the name de Winter. I've never attended a Mrs. de Winter in my life.
Colonel Julian asked.
Could she have come to see you and given a false name? Why, yes, that's possible. It's rather unusual, of course. Would you have any records of the visit on your files? I know it's not etiquette to ask, but the circumstances are very unusual. We do feel her appointment with you must have had some bearing on the case, and her subsequent death.
Murder,
said Favell. Dr. Baker raised his eyebrows and looked inquiringly at Maxim.
I had no idea there was any question of that. Of course I understand, and I'll do anything in my power to help you. If you'll excuse me a few minutes, I'll go and look up my files.
Presently, Dr. Baker came back into the room with a large book and a file case in his hands. He carried them over to the table, opened the book and began turning the pages.
The 12th, did you say, at 2 o'clock? Oh.
We none of us moved. We all watched his face.
I saw a Mrs. Danvers on the 12th at 2 o'clock. She gave a wrong name, of course,
said Maxim.
That was obvious from the first. Do you remember the visit now, Dr. Baker? Yes, Mrs. Danvers, I remember now.
He read through the files, then replaced them in the case. He glanced at Maxim.
Of course, this is unprofessional, you know. We treat patients as though they were in the confessional. But your wife is dead, and I quite understand the circumstances are exceptional. You want to know if I can suggest any motive why your wife should have taken her life. I think I can. The woman who called herself Mrs. Danvers was very seriously ill. The pain was slight as yet, but the growth was deep-rooted, and in 3 or 4 months' time she would have been under morphia. An operation would have been no earthly use at all. The X-ray photographs showed a certain malformation of the uterus, I remember, which meant she could never have had a child. But that was quite apart. It had nothing to do with the disease.
I remember hearing Colonel Julian speak, saying something about Dr. Baker being very kind to have taken so much trouble.
You've told us all we want to know, and if we could possibly have a copy of the memorandum in your file, it might be very useful. Of course,
said Dr. Baker.
Of course.
We went and stood by the car. No one said anything for a few minutes. Colonel Julian handed round his cigarette case. Favell looked grey, rather shaken. I noticed his hands were trembling as he held the match.
Shall we get into the car and go?
Said Colonel Julian to Maxim.
We can make our plans as we go along.
Maxim held open the door of the car, and Colonel Julian climbed in. I sat down in my seat in the front. Favell still leant against the car and did not move. He was watching Maxim. He had lost the grey colour now, and the old unpleasant smile was forming on his lips.
It's been a stroke of luck for you, hasn't it, Max? You think you've won, don't you? The law can get you yet, and so can I, in a different way.
He stepped back onto the pavement, the smile still on his lips. The car slid forward. As we turned the corner, I looked back and saw him standing there watching us, and he waved his hand, and he was laughing. We drove on for a while in silence. Then Colonel Julian spoke.
He can't do anything. That smile and that wave were part of his bluff. They're all alike, those fellows. He hasn't a thread of a case to bring now. Baker's evidence would squash it.
Maxim did not answer. I glanced sideways at his face, but it told me nothing. We drove on through the northern suburbs and came once more to Finchley and Hampstead. Colonel Julian said,
What do you propose doing? I've got a sister living in St. John's Wood and feel inclined to take her unawares and ask for dinner, and then catch the last train from Paddington. Could you throw me out at my sister's?
When we came to the house, Maxim drew up a little way ahead of the gate.
It's impossible to thank you for all you've done today. You know what I feel about it without my telling you. My dear fellow, I've been only too glad. If only we'd known what Baker knew, of course, there'd have been none of this at all. Well, goodbye to you both. Don't get overtired. It's been a long day.
Now that we were alone again, the strain was over. The sensation was one of almost unbearable relief. Maxim did not speak. I felt his hand cover mine. We drove through the traffic, and I saw none of it. Nothing could touch us any more. We had come through our crisis.
We'll find somewhere on the road we can put up for the night. Then we can get along to Mandalay in the morning.
Yes, I said.
I believe that Rebecca lied to me on purpose. The last supreme bluff. She wanted me to kill her. She foresaw the whole thing. That's why she laughed. That's why she stood there laughing when she died.
I did not say anything. We had supper in Soho. At one point, Maxim went to the telephone to call Frank. In 10 minutes, he came back. Well, I said, my own voice sounding far away. How was Frank?
Frank was all right. I told him what had happened. He sounded glad, relieved.
Yes, I said.
Something rather odd, though. He thinks Mrs. Danvers has cleared out. About 10 minutes before I rang up, Frith telephoned to Frank and said there had been a long-distance call from Mrs. Danvers, which he had switched through to her room, and she had answered. This must have been about 6:10. At 6:45, he knocked on the door and found her room empty. Her bedroom, too. They think she's gone.
Isn't it a good thing? She can't do anything. If she's gone, so much the better. It was Favell who telephoned her, of course. Colonel Julian said if there was any attempt at blackmail, we were to tell him. They won't dare do it. They can't. It's too dangerous.
I'm not thinking of blackmail.
What else can they do? It's all over, darling. It's finished. We ought to go down on our knees and thank God that it's finished. Maxim did not answer. He was staring in front of him at nothing. Suddenly he said,
Have you finished? I don't think I want any more. Only coffee. Black, very strong, please, and the bill.
I wondered why we must go so soon. It was comfortable in the restaurant, and there was nothing to take us away. I followed Maxim out of the restaurant, stumbling a little and yawning.
Listen, do you think you could sleep in the car if I wrapped you up with a rug and tucked you down in the back?
Yes. Yes, I suppose so. But you'll be so tired.
No, I shall be all right. I want to get home. Something's wrong, I know it is. I want to get home.
His face was anxious, strange. I climbed into the back of the car, and Maxim got in the front and switched on the engine. I shut my eyes. It seemed as if I dozed for a while. Then I sat up and pushed my hair away from my face. I can't sleep. It's no use.
You've been sleeping. You've slept for hours. It's 2:15. We're 4 miles the other side of Lanyon.
I climbed over and sat beside him, staring in front of me through the windscreen. I put my hand on his knee. The hills rose in front of us, and dipped, and rose again. It was quite dark. The stars had gone. What time did you say it was? I asked.
2:20.
That's funny. It looks almost as though the dawn was breaking over there, beyond those hills. Can't be, though. It's too early.
It's the wrong direction. You're looking west.
I know. It's funny, isn't it? He did not answer, and I went on watching the sky. It seemed to get lighter, even as I stared, like the first red streak of sunrise. Little by little it spread across the sky. It's in winter you see the northern lights, isn't it? I said. Not in summer.
That's not the northern lights. That's Mandalay.
I glanced at him and saw his face. I saw his eyes. Maxim, I said. Maxim, what is it? He drove faster, much faster, and topped the hill before us. The road to Mandalay lay ahead. There was no moon. The sky above our heads was inky black. But the sky on the horizon was not dark at all. It was shot with crimson, like a splash of blood. And the ashes blew towards us with the salt wind from the sea.